Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Charles Powell, and I'm the director of the Elkanah Royal Institute. And it's my honor and pleasure to introduce this session that we've organized today. And before I do so, let me also thank my colleague, Iliana Olivier, for having put it together. The purpose of this meeting, as you know, is to discuss European Union and Spanish cooperation, looking back at lessons learned and looking forward, trying to predict how this field may develop in years to come. So we're basically going to try this morning to examine the main challenges that the EU currently faces as a global development actor, and also how Spain perceives these challenges and how they should be coped with. As you all know, these challenges include things like the consequences of internal phenomena, most notably Brexit, but also the consolidation of non-traditional donors such as China. And of course, all of this is taking place in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, which sadly is still very much with us. This changing environment in which the EU operates will, I think, or is already producing an interesting debate as to the role of the European Union as a global development actor, in fact, one of the most important global development actors, but also one which wishes to promote specific values that differentiates it from other aid powers, while at the same time offering appealing tools for partner countries. From this perspective, the current aid instruments and the proposals which already exist for the 2021-2027 cycle will also obviously feature very prominently in this conversation. And I trust we will be looking at instruments such as the Neighbourhood Development and International Cooperation Instrument, the new financial tools that now exist for loans and guarantees coming from the private sector, the institutional architecture of European financial cooperation itself, the joint programming, improvement of coordination and ownership tools, or delegated cooperation, among other many issues. As those of you who follow our work know, this roundtable basically feeds into Elkanah's broader effort to look at the European Union's external action from a Spanish perspective, which has been one of the top priorities of our Brussels office, which, as many of you will know, is led by my colleague Luis Simon. In fact, over the last year, we've held several workshops on EU foreign and security policy in an attempt to understand how the COVID crisis may affect the EU's position in the world and, of course, Spain's perception of this position in the world. So today, we're very much hoping to put the EU's international cooperation policy in its broader strategic and foreign policy perspective, and also hopefully to get a sense of how Spain sees this field developing as we go forward. And to discuss all of these very interesting issues, we have a wonderful lineup. Let me first of all introduce Gabriel Ferrero de Loma, who is Director General for Sustainable Development Policies at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, European Union and Cooperation here in Madrid. Good morning, Gabriel, and thank you very much for joining us. Gabriel is a former member of the Office of the UN Secretary General's team for the 2030 Agenda and Climate Change 2012-2017, and the UN High-Level Task Force on Global Food Security. So welcome, Gabriel. We also have with us Geert Laporte, who is the Deputy Director of the European Centre for Development Policy Management, who is joining us from Ghent. And he is also the Director of the European Think Tanks Group, a network of leading European think tanks with 350 policy researchers working on EU international cooperation for global sustainable development, which the Elkanah Royal Institute has very recently joined. So let me also take this opportunity, Gert, to thank you for your support, personal support in this matter. And last, but by no means least, we have with us Damien Barshish, who heads the Sustainable Development Governance Programme at IDDRI and is also a member of the European Think Tank Group. So let me welcome you all again, and I understand Gabriel has the floor first. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Charles. Good morning, dear colleagues, and thank you very much indeed to Real Instituto Elcano for convening this timely and such a relevant discussion, and for inviting Secretary of State Ángeles Moreno to present our vision. As you know, unfortunately, Ms. Moreno hasn't been able to join in person, as she's traveling today to Honduras, accompanying Queen Letizia on a field visit to the areas most impacted by the recent hurricanes. She sends her warm regards, Charles, regretting that she couldn't join today. Well, I will start with some reflections about the current context in which this discussion is taking place before addressing our core thesis on the relationship between the Spanish cooperation and the EU, and which is that the future is an European Spanish cooperation and also a European cooperation that is more Spanish in some ways. Well, no doubt the shape of EU foreign policy in general and of development cooperation in particular is evolving at a time of major systemic changes and major shocks, such as the pandemic or such as those you mentioned, Charles, as Brexit and others. It is evolving, hence, in a context which is more complex than before. And I would like to touch base briefly before addressing this relationship on these issues. Well, no doubt, 2015 was a landmark in achieving major advances in the multilateralism and in development global policy, not least, as we all know, obviously, the adoption of the Paris Agreement on climate change, the 2030 Agenda, and the Addis Ababa Agenda for Action, which all established a central framework for tackling development challenges at the global level, and no doubt this is the overall framework in which we are all moving ahead. Nevertheless, since then, we have seen a steady erosion of this international consensus, with a growing role of populist and nationalist policies that view international relations more as a zero-sum game, disregarding the central role of global public goods and to a big extent to multilateralism. These policy positions have proliferated, and unfortunately both in developed countries, even including in some cases within the EU, and in developing countries, making it much more complicated today to reach agreements like those in 2015. Moreover, and you mentioned this already, Charles, emerging donors, especially China and others, are playing an increasingly high-profile role, meaning that they cannot be ignored when addressing global challenges and international initiatives in the area of development. The recent negotiation of the Common Framework for Debt Restructuring, for instance, provides a very good example of this, whereas just a few years ago, the coordination of debt relief initiatives was carried out within the Paris Club, where the traditional donor countries are represented. Today would be unthinkable to take on an initiative of this kind without bringing in China, which is why parallel negotiations have been conducted within the G20. We could also talk about the vaccine diplomacy or the impact of vaccine research in this global context, but it would lead us probably to a much longer discussion. Well, a third essential element is the essential, increasingly important role of non-state actors, and very especially the private sector, in the development process of our partner countries. The 2030 Agenda and the achievement of the SDGs, we know, present funding challenges of an enormous scale. We are not talking anymore just about poverty alleviation, but about transforming economies and transforming systems. So, in this new context, ODA must play, no doubt, a key role, but also in leveraging these additional resources, incentivizing the participation of the private sectors in those areas and industries where they can maximize its impact in terms of development and of achieving the SDGs. But more importantly, embedding the SDGs into business models so that regardless of the investment side of their action, businesses and the private sector are active constructors, active builders of the 2030 Agenda, not just by creating employment, but as vectors of respecting human rights, respecting environmental issues, protecting the environment and natural resource management, etc. In conclusion, we must deal with less cohesion on the part of traditional actors, as well as a greater diversity of overall actors in general, in what some consider a crisis of multilateralism and of a liberal world order that rose after the Second World War. This is a scenario where we must face and tackle the COVID pandemic and the deep economic crisis that brings in its wake. The pandemic's impact threatens to create setbacks in development advances. We all know decades of progress in many countries, going back to what we could see as a pre-MDG era. Well, this brings me to my central idea, my central thesis, which is our vision. How do we foresee Spanish development cooperation vis-a-vis the EU in, let's say, 15, 20 years from now? Well, in this overall context, our vision is a Spanish cooperation fully integrated in the EU development cooperation, and that operates under a Team Europe single brand, single program, and single action. A vision that points at our country partnership frameworks being the EU ones, our development cooperation master plans being the EU ones, and hence an EU policy that fully integrates our priorities, thematic and geographically, and on the other hand, an EU development cooperation that takes the best features of our Spanish development cooperation added value, which is possibly not related to the size of our budget, nor to the size of our agency or of our development financial institution, but rather it may be related to the way in which we prioritize dialogue with our partners, genuinely respecting priorities, the way in which we face and approach country ownership, or the way in which Spanish development system integrates the contribution of civil society and decentralized cooperation. It is within this complex international scenario that we must situate the necessary reform of the Spanish development cooperation system and the major changes at the EU level as well. Well, no doubt, EU development cooperation has become the essential element of Spanish cooperation policies. If we go back to figures of the 2.6 billion euros allocated to ODA in Spanish budget in 2019, up to 1.15 billion euros, this means 44% of total, was earmarked for development cooperation policies being implemented by EU institutions. Furthermore, Spanish cooperation is playing a leading role in every area of the European aid effectiveness agenda, known as working better together, such as joint programming, joint implementation, and joint evaluation, including reciprocal delegated cooperation and new financial instruments. To date, the Spanish Agency for International Development Cooperation, ICID, and the International and Ibero-American Foundation for Administration and Public Policies, FIAP, have formalized 99 agreements worth more than 760 million euros, with Spanish co-financing approximately 453 million. If we see in this strategic vision, this dynamic of delegated cooperation from the EU to Spanish development system, what we could see is that we are actually starting to exercise this transition to a much more Spanish European cooperation, or a much more European cooperation that is fully embedding Spanish priorities. So therefore, we envision a European cooperation, the future of European cooperation as Spanish cooperation, aligning Spanish aid with European one, while maintaining Spanish influence on the design of the overall design of EU development policies. It is therefore essential to ensure that the coordination and alignment of our development cooperation policy with the European cooperation policy as a whole. To this end, we must guarantee that the values, principles, and priorities that guide Spanish cooperation are also among EU priorities, obviously. However, at the same time, Spain, as the fourth largest contributor to the EU budget, and therefore the fourth largest funder of the EU development cooperation policy must not be a passive bystander in the crafting of EU policy. Rather, it must play a leading role that enables Spain's priorities to be reflected in the design of European policies. If you will allow me to coin an expression, we must not only Europeanize or make more European Spanish development cooperation policy, rather we also aspire to Spanishize or make EU development cooperation policy a bit more Spanish in some of these ways. So what do I mean when talking about aligning Spanish cooperation with its European counterpart? What are we aiming at when reforming the Spanish development cooperation system? Well, the first of these elements is one of the guiding principles of the profound reform the Spanish development cooperation system is currently undertaking, which is the basic foundation, the 1998 Act on International Development Cooperation, which has governed our development system for more than 20 years, that needs now a comprehensive update for the 21st century to incorporate elements such as the centrality of the 2030 Agenda and the SDGs, and in the area of the EU, the new European Consensus on Development adopted in 2017. This regulatory framework is called to solve certain problems that we have detected, to improve coordination between the principal cooperation actors in the Spanish system, and no doubt to increase the power and articulation of our financial cooperation. Moreover, we cannot wait any longer to strengthen the Spanish agency in terms of its human resources and its management capacity. In this context, our priority must therefore be to launch during these coming months a participatory process that will enable us to have, hopefully by the end of 2021, a whole new legal framework and a renovated, reinforced architecture of development cooperation aid. The goal is to soon have a new vision for Spanish cooperation statement, furnishing guidance for the future master plan and for the reform, which must be drawn up throughout 2021, and which you hope will be very closely aligned with this European mirror. During this coming year, we also intend to improve and to approve a new act and the whole legislative architecture framework for this new institutional setup, so that we hope to be running at full speed by 2022. A renovated, properly furnished structure with a greater capacity to executing spending is what will enable us to manage, hopefully, the 0.5% of our GDP in ODA, which is our goal by the end of this term of Parliament. How are we trying to influence EU development cooperation? This refers to the current context in which the NDICI, the new development cooperation instrument from the EU multi-year financial framework, and also the new Team Europe spirit, and obviously, of course, the joint programming exercises are in place. If we approach from the other side, as I was saying before, we must play the role corresponding to us as one of the main donors when the EU development cooperation policy is being designed. Through its EU membership, Spain is an essential part of the world's leading donor, with a present and potential influence in cooperation spanning the entire globe, and very specifically on key areas such as Latin America and the Caribbean. Spain, as one of the EU's principal members, must play a key role of, as I said, as a decision maker and not just decision taker in the definition of the EU development policy. And this is what we have been doing during the last months when negotiating and shaping up the Neighbourhood Development and International Development Cooperation Instrument, the so-called NDICI, and we very much hope that at the end of this period, the name is shifted and changed to something like Europe 2030 or Sustainable Europe or Global Europe 2030, some brand that is far less technocratic and far more visionary than NDICI. And in this process, as I was saying, we have been defending the compatibility of greater coordination of European instruments and of those of the member states with the active participation of partner countries at the driver's seat in the design of development policies. Indeed, development cooperation must serve as a leveraging policy of the SDGs, and the aid effectiveness principles, which is one of our core principles of our development policy, must constitute one of its essential pillars within the EU. Spain has also defended, as I was saying, the importance of ensuring adequate funding for priority regions, including Sub-Saharan Africa and Southern Neighbourhood, but very specifically maintaining our cooperation with partner countries in Latin America, bearing in mind the special challenges faced by middle-income countries and the strategic importance of the Euro-Latin America space of shared values in Spain's commitment to multilateralism. Also noteworthy is Spain's position on adequate funding for global challenges and the need to contribute to the financing of global public goods in line with the leadership role that the EU must play in defending multilateralism within the international community. Furthermore, we fully agree that the private sector must play a central role in development. However, from the Spanish perspective, we must use aid to create the right incentives to strengthen the alignment of business models from the private sector with the SDGs. And this involves strengthening the principle of policy first and the procedures for oversight and due diligence, compliant with the environmental, social, and governance standards, and with respect for human rights. This is the core values of the EU, and when we are talking about promoting investments from our private sector in developing countries, we must put these values at the forefront, ensuring that all our due diligence process makes the businesses and the private sector of the European Union countries vectors of the SDGs and therefore vectors of the European values. And finally, it should be mentioned that along with designing new financial instruments, the EU is also immersed in major transformations on how development cooperation policies are implemented, strengthening joint programming mechanisms with an eye to the immediate future, launching the Team Europe package, the EU's contribution to building back better, greener and fairer to the post-COVID crisis. And here, the active participation of every level of Spanish public administrations in development cooperation is also notable. The NDICI is committed to making partnerships between public administrations the linchpin for coordinating geostrategic cooperation with real development outcomes and impacts. And these partnerships must support an external action system built on our shared values as reflected in the 2030 Agenda and guide other instruments such as financial cooperation and the investment environment. It is important for Spain to take ownership of the ongoing European programming process, participating in its national, regional, and thematic definition. And to this end, we have actually mobilized every level of our administration, of our network of embassies and technical cooperation offices coordinated by the Spanish agency, with the support of FIAP and taking advantage of their on-the-ground know-how to actively contribute to define the geographic programming and the Team Europe initiatives in different countries. We are also a champion for the last 10 years on the integration of Team Europe, of joint programming exercises at the axis of our partnership frameworks, and we will be doing so in the future and stronger, with the goal of achieving greater coordination among European donors on the ground, but always safeguarding ownership on the part of our partner countries. So, in concluding, our present really makes it unthinkable to define Spanish development cooperation policies separately for the European Union ones. We envision a dynamic which is a fully integrated European and Spanish development aid in 15-20 years. And now we must take advantage of our synergies, seeking clear alignment of our policy with EU policies, while also ensuring that the main themes of the European development policy also respond to our own values, interests, and priorities. Development cooperation must be integrated into the rest of EU policies and into the post-pandemic recovery effort as a whole. This clearly represents an asset and that must contribute to shaping the EU and Spain within it as the global power in a multipolar world that puts sustainable development, inclusion, equality, poverty eradication, and some the SDGs at the core. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gabriel. I think that's actually the most ambitious and comprehensive account of Spanish development aid I've listened to in a very long time, so congratulations. I'm not sure whether I'm meant to be moderating this, Ileana, or so who is the next speaker then?
So Gert should be.
Gert, the floor is yours. Microphone is yours. Thank you, Gabriel.
Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation, very enlightening. I will concentrate my reaction and my points on three particular issues. The first one is some reflections on the current context of global development, and a lot has already been said by Gabriel. Secondly, I will look at the role that the European Union is playing in global development right now, at this very moment. And then thirdly, I will try to also make a few recommendations as to how the European Union could strengthen its leadership role in global development. Now, first, some reflections on global development. A lot has already been said by Gabriel Ferrero, but it's true, first of all, that we are in a context which has an increasing complexity. Development is no longer about eradicating poverty, about purely human development objectives. It's also about social justice. It's about equality. It's about democratic governance, human rights, inclusive societies. So tackling these types of issues is an integral part of international development. And then, of course, we also have the mutual interdependencies, the major threats, climate change, environmental sustainability, peace and security, equal distribution of resources, the pandemics, how to fight and deal with pandemics, one of the forgotten dimensions in many of the European strategies, by the way, including the strategy with Africa of March of this year. So in brief, we need in this increasing complexity a more holistic approach. That's absolutely needed. Second element of our context in global development is, and it was also stressed by Gabriel, that we need more than ever joint action in international cooperation. All actors, public, private, at all levels, local, national, regional, global, need to cooperate. And this is a very important message to all of us. If we want to deal with the complexity of this global agenda, we will have to join forces at all levels. And thirdly, there's a sense of urgency. It was also stressed by Gabriel. There's major shocks at this moment going on, and not at least the COVID-19. So the global recovery will put all of us under pressure to act fast and effectively. Now, I'm coming to my second part. What is the role that the European Union is playing at this moment in global development? And we shouldn't be blind for the fact that the EU as such is losing weight in today's multipolar world. There's competing development models. China was mentioned. But we see a gradual shift of gravity, of the center of gravity, away from Europe and from the so-called Western world. We see an erosion of rules-based global order. We see rising nationalism and populism worldwide. But at the same time, and there I have a more positive message, it is my feeling that the European Union still presents an attractive model. An attractive model of soft power for populations in developing countries. Why? There's a number of shared values. There's a regulated social market economy. And in spite of many pressures on our societies, we see that there is still a certain level of social cohesion. And that's quite attractive in the developing world. So we should not underestimate the attractiveness of the European model. And what are the assets of the European Union to play a key role in global development? First of all, the European Union is a champion in terms of the volumes of international cooperation, development finance. We know this for quite some time already. More than half of all international aid is European aid. But of course, this is not the most important feature. Another feature where Europe is quite attractive is the fact that it is an innovator in terms of development policies. I'm talking most of the time now on what is stated on paper in the different strategies. But if you look at the global strategy, the European Consensus for Development, the successive strategies with Africa, the Green Deal, for example, these are all quite innovative strategies. The European Union is quite good at putting nice ideas on paper. And it is, of course, also leading on global agendas, as we have noticed already, at the Paris Agreement, climate change, the value agendas, peace building, the SDGs. They all have somewhere a European stamp. Europe always has been very active in these types of international agreements. And there is a strong civil society in Europe that is still playing an important role. And a public opinion that is still pro-development in most countries in Europe. So this is all very important. These are major assets of the European Union, and we are not always aware of that. But of course, we also struggle with a number of hurdles in practice. And if you really want to play an effective leadership role, what we have seen in the past decades is that Europe is fragmented. It has competing institutions and actors. It has parallel agreements, parallel financing instruments. There's a big problem of path dependency on traditional donor-recipient cooperation agreements. Some of you might know that ECDPM has been doing quite some in-depth political economy analysis of, for example, ACP-EU cooperation. And it always has been for me a bit an enigma why the European Union is supporting an arrangement, an ACP-EU arrangement, that is not being supported by its own members, because the members are not willing to put money into their own ACP institutions. That's quite strange. So I call this a relic of the path dependency of 50 years of traditional development cooperation. It's also difficult to work together, member states and Commission. Europe is not always consistent in applying its own standards, double standards in terms of value agendas, the migration issue that has not always been dealt with in a good manner. And it's also difficult for the European Union to translate some of its international commitments, in casu the Agenda 2030, into practice. At this moment, there is no EU member state that is really on track in implementing the SDG agenda as it was planned to do so. This is, in practice, the way the European Union has to correct a number of hurdles, hindrances, to make it a real effective global player. So what needs to be done? My last point. I have 5 recommendations. The first one is that the European Union should continue to fully integrate development policy into the EU's foreign policy. We should be very clear about our EU interests and promote these instead of just presenting the European Union as a so-called do-gooder or a solidarity type of institution or a provider of North-South solidarity. That's all fine. But let's be clear as well about own interests. And this is something that I always notice when I deal with our African friends, African partners. They are a bit fed up with the story that Europe is there to help Africa. No, Europe is there because it has strong strategic, economic, and other interests in Africa. Let's be clear about it. We should also be sure that it is important to make political and interest-driven beneficial types of partnerships. And this is also a big challenge. Most of the partnerships should be reflecting that intention to really look at all the dimensions of international cooperation, all the dimensions of international development. And maybe the imminent change of DG DEFCO into DG International Partnerships as of January next year could be a first step to indicate that this is not only about aid and about development, but about interconnectivity between various internal and external EU policies. Second recommendation, I think the European Union should continue to stand behind its value agendas. They are important. Inclusive societies, rule of law, gender, rights-based approaches. Someone has to do it, and Gabrielle also referred to that. It is an important element of Europe's identity, and we should stand up on this in this world where these value agendas are more and more coming under big pressure. But we should do it in a smart way, without the usual conditionalities, without overestimating our power at this moment. You cannot buy reforms or impose values with conditionalities. This is a longer-term investment in a whole range of new types of actors, so there's some work to be done there. Thirdly, the EU should continue to play a global norms and standard-setting role. New global norms on trade, standards of transparency, labor rights, sustainable production and consumption patterns, environmental legislation. These are all areas where the European Union is, to some extent, a champion. And this should continue because we see that others are following to the extent possible and trying to adopt some of these standards. And this is positive. This is one of the soft power components of the European identity. Fourth, we need new types and ways of development finance, and NDICI was mentioned as the new single instrument. We have 70 billion euros at the disposal of development and international cooperation and neighborhood. It's good that we bring together all the different existing instruments. So it's to some extent a major progress that is now being realized. We have the ODA, the loans, the guarantees, technical cooperation, external lending, blended financing, the EDF, which was there for the ACP countries. All this will be integrated in one instrument. So there will be more coherence, and the programming will also be done in a more integrated and probably also in a more politically savvy type of way. But major challenges will remain. For example, country ownership. To what extent will country ownership be preserved in a context where the European Union is extremely happy to put forward now its own interest agendas? We need to find the right balance. And then last but not least, we need to also have this united and coordinated Europe approach, better working together, to which Gabriel was referring a lot in his presentation. It is a must-have. The joint programming, the Team Europe approach, these are all promising elements. And I think that we should indeed take account of what Gabriel has said. It's not only about Europeanizing international or European cooperation, but maybe there is also a need to Spanishize and Francophonize or whatever some of the elements of the EU cooperation agenda. And then my last recommendation, I think the European Union is almost condemned to build alliances with other like-minded groups of countries. We need to build these coalitions in this global world. And maybe the US under Biden will open new perspectives, but there is also Japan, there is also Canada, there is Australia. There's a whole range of like-minded partners who think to a large extent along the same lines. And I think the European Union should make efforts to build those alliances, to make them more stronger, because this is extremely important. If we do not accelerate that alliance building in a post-COVID-19 context, we will all have major problems to confront the consequences of this current crisis. I stop here. Thank you very much for the attention.
Thank you very much, Gert. And let me remind our viewers that they can send their questions to the following email address, actividades@rielcano.org, or they can also do so via our Twitter feed using the hashtag EU-Spain Cooperation. So let me hand over now to Damien. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Charles, and thanks all for the very interesting speeches and comments regarding the EU and Spanish cooperation. Part of my comments are based on the paper we will publish soon with our German partners from the IE on the 2030 agenda and the Green Deal. And I would like to try to address two key questions. So what is really our collective ambition for the European external action and for the EU as a global development actor? And secondly, what role Spain could or should play in order to support this ambition? I will start my presentation by two quotes. First, Commission President von der Leyen stated in May that the Sustainable Development Goals and the 2030 Agenda are now more important than ever and called for a global recovery initiative that links investment and debriefs to the SDGs. Secondly, at the last G20 summit, the president of the Spain government, Mr. Sanchez, highlighted the 2030 Agenda as a genuine social contract that must guide our efforts. He also several times point out that the 2030 Agenda is a national roadmap to tackle current challenges and contribute to shared and sustainable development at the global level. So if we really take it at the face value, the 2030 Agenda is a promise to act differently, to act better. If we really expect to make Europe the leading global development actor, one of the key elements to structure this ambition should be the 2030 Agenda. It could give orientation for sustainable development, of course, within the EU, for the EU internal policies, and for the global cooperation. It provides guidance on how to make the stimulus package and recovery measures not only economically sustainable, but also from a social, ecological, and global perspective. Even so, Commission President von der Leyen tasks all commissioners to contribute towards SDG implementation. The Commission has still not made the 2030 Agenda a prominent guideline for domestic and external policy making. So, at the EU level, what should we do differently? First, beyond the discussion on the budget, we really need to make an effort to align the NDICI with the 2030 Agenda. Secondly, we should use the 2030 Agenda to reduce negative spillovers, which the EU generates for third countries. Thirdly, we should give strategic priority to the 2030 Agenda in the EU's external relations. On these three recommendations, I think we could expect Spain to push for it within the EU as a real SDG champion with a strong political will regarding the 2030 Agenda. Aligning the NDICI with the 2030 Agenda, the NDICI will be the EU's key financial instrument for up to almost 2030, deciding whether the EU will deliver or not on the decade of action in order to reach the global goals. Unfortunately, it does not make meaningful reference to the SDGs. Nevertheless, the financial resources foreseen have the potential to support sustainability transformation in partners countries. As an overarching comprehensive approach for SDG implementation is missing, the 2030 Agenda and the SDG currently play two main roles. First, key principles of the 2030 Agenda are referred to in the Green Deal and other policy priorities. Second, the SDGs are used for monitoring purposes. In the context of the NDICI, the Commission will report on which cooperation projects contribute to which SDGs. However, without a comprehensive SDG approach, including the key SDG transformations, it is difficult to use the SDGs to also inform the policy formulation. And it's really something it's missing here. It would be very relevant that the EU express a strong commitment to making the 2030 Agenda and the SDGs its compass for external action in order to really strengthen resilience in its partner countries. My second point is the idea to really reduce the negative international spillover. The creation of a single instrument for the EU's external action is an important step towards greater coherence. It could provide an impetus to reduce negative spillover which the EU generates for third countries. The spillover effects refer to countries' domestic action that have positive and negative effects on other countries' ability to achieve the SDGs. And the EU the EU spillover effect relates to social and environmental policies, economic or security policies. And these spillovers are currently negative. External action will not be enough to turn around the EU's negative spillover balance. In fact, many negative spillover that the EU produces are related to instruments and policies placed outside the NDICI, such as agricultural, environmental, or trade policy. Moreover, preventive negative spillover is less a financial matter than a challenge of policy making and programming. So, to comprehensively contribute to a reduction of negative spillover effect, policy coherence for sustainable development needs to be put into practice in the programming of the EU external and internal action alike. My last point is to give a strategic priority to the 2030 agenda in the EU's external relations with both richer and poorer countries. In light of the international legitimacy of the 2030 agenda, the EU should use it more strategically as a framework of reference in its relation with the neighborhood, Africa, North America, Latin America, or even China. Instead of pointing to individual SDGs, the 2030 agenda can help to orient the EU's international partnership to really support key transformations. While the Green Deal is a high priority within the EU and has de facto important impact on third countries, its legitimacy as a framework for international cooperation is really limited. The EU's bilateral partnership with countries and regions will need to take the 2030 agenda as a starting point and formulate cooperation strategies that contribute to cooperating with countries and regions on the key transformation outlined in the Global Sustainable Development Report, the GSDR. This would require that the EU also make the 2030 agenda a key priority in trade, investment, or security policy, as well as in its relation also to key industrialized countries. To conclude, we could expect from Spain to push within the EU for a better use of the 2030 agenda as a strategical and a political tool for European policies dealing with external action. The EU is still not the global SDG champion that it should be. And if I try to comment what Gabriel said and Geert also on the Spanishize the EU cooperation, I think that one way to Spanishize the EU cooperation would be to SDGize the EU cooperation. Thanks a lot.
Okay, so thank you very much, all of you. We still have a few minutes, around 10 minutes, for questions from the audience and questions from the audience. So I already have a couple of questions from the public, and I also have one question myself. So starting with the others, the first question could be, how should the EU deal with China in Africa? So it's a difficult question. So maybe Geert, since we only have 10 minutes, maybe Geert, you could add something on that. The second question is on the 2030 agenda that Damien has insisted on. So should the EU address the whole 2030 agenda, or should it specialize or focus on a part of it? And then I have a couple of questions myself, maybe for Gabriel. So thank you very much for your presentation, which was very, very comprehensive. And you focused on the how and on the when, at effectiveness, Team Europe, the NDICI, hopefully with a new name. I would like to know if you could elaborate a bit more on the what. Damien gave this idea of Spanishizing EU development cooperation by focusing more on the 2030 agenda. That's also something that you mentioned. But you also mentioned more specific issues such as the partnership with Latin America and the Caribbean, or the middle income countries debate. And regarding this, I was wondering to what extent this debate on the middle income countries, which was probably very pertinent and relevant in the 90s or the 2000s, is still an issue where Spain can still insist on, in the current context that you described, given that we are shifting from the focus on poverty reduction, as Gerd described, to more strategic development relations, and to what extent it would be more regional or more timely to focus on Latin America as a partner in a new multilateral system and a partner for the implementation of the 2030 agenda. And I think that's all for now. So maybe in the same order, Gabriel, you could start, then Gert and Damien.
Thank you very much, Iliana, and thank you, Damien and Gerd, for such an insightful presentations. I have been really challenged by your points, and we will fully take most of them into account. And going to your two concrete questions, Iliana, from the audience. Well, first, referring to the 2030 agenda, or putting the 2030 agenda at the core of the Spanish development cooperation and the EU. Well, I would like to emphasize, I fully agree on what Damien was saying. It may be due to the fact that the EU, together with Latin America and other middle-income countries, I would add, and of course some other partners, African countries, etc., was part of the force, or of the major force, that brought the 2030 agenda and the Paris Agreement on what it was and what it is already. That we see that the EU values actually are fully encompassed by the 2030 agenda and the Paris Agreement. So we don't see EU values or EU global interests, strategic interests, being apart from the 2030 agenda. So this is my first reaction. So indeed, yes, and we have been actually systematically pointing out this fundamental, if you want, or this axioma or starting point when talking about NDICI, for instance, during the last two or 3 years. I mean, this is the starting point, and we still remain fully convinced that the 2030 agenda, I mean, with all the tweaks we may want to introduce in terms of the rights-based language, or in terms of more ambitious targets on X or Y SDGs, that actually encompass our vision of the world we want, and it is still valid. So we have been making, as I said, systematically, and we continue referring to this fundamental on the NDICI and/or the EU framework, policy framework discussions in Brussels and elsewhere, and of course putting the SDGs at the core of our dialogue with partner countries. And this is a fact that is very important, is the way in which we put the 2030 agenda at the center of the dialogue. And this may make that huge difference between countries. We are not putting one SDG or the other SDG at the core priority. And the secret and the transformative power of the 2030 agenda is to put the whole 17 SDGs and the whole narrative behind the 2030 agenda into the discussion. So if we are going to be partnering, for instance, on food security or agriculture with one country, we may be prioritizing this area, but we put together the 17 SDGs. So we put together climate, we put together human rights, we put together decent work, we put together inclusive growth generated by these investments in agriculture. We put together the whole of SDG 2, including small-scale farming or family farming at the center, and sustainable agriculture practices. So it is the whole of the 2030 agenda, what we put at the center. And then the second question, Iliana, when we talk about Latin American countries or middle-income countries, well, I would like to separate both, because not exactly, I mean, we're talking about the middle-income countries, multiple traps on all this discussion at the academic level and in practical level. It is indeed obviously very relevant, but there are such huge differences between middle-income countries themselves that I don't like to talk about middle-income countries in general, except from the more meek traps in the academic terms. So referring to Latin America and the Caribbean, and it is not just before there is a strategic shift from poverty reduction. I actually argue that there is not such a strategic shift from poverty reduction. The shift is to poverty eradication and to poverty in all its dimensions and to poverty everywhere. And this is the strategic shift and the comprehensive approach to this aspiration. But going back to Latin American countries, and why is so important for us? I mean, it's not the fact that most of the poor people in the world live in middle-income countries, which is a fact. It's not just the fact that inequalities, which is at the core of our vision and of the 2030 Agenda vision, by the way, it is especially suffered in middle-income countries, and especially in Latin America and the Caribbean. It is also because the strategic partnerships between Latin America and the European and the countries or Europe is probably one of the core parts of the transformative power globally. And we have already seen this with the 2030 Agenda and the Paris Agreement, which was very much arguably the result of a Latin America-Europe force or alliance, maybe not explicit alliance from the outset, but in practical terms. So we can see and track back and see how Colombia, Guatemala, other Latin American countries, together with the European ones, were in 2011, 2012, pushing and moving ahead on the 2030 Agenda and the SDGs. So it's more than the development agenda. It's the strategic force, joining forces to transform the world in the way in which the EU values point at. Sorry for extending a bit, Lena. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabriel. Meanwhile, we have received 2 additional questions, also very difficult questions. So maybe, Gerd, Damien, you can also address those during your intervention. So first of all, do we have the political will in member countries, including Spain, to accept that member country cooperation is subordinated to new development cooperation? In other words, is Team Europe a real possibility in the near future? Is it useful for poor countries and for development if European development cooperation is streamlined? One could argue that there is a need for different approaches, different visions, different concepts, that partly for poor countries to choose what they like, partly because no one has the solution to development. So is it possible to have just one EU development cooperation policy? And the last question on migration. Migration is key priority area for the EU and definitely Spain in the new NDICI. How do you recommend to strike that balance between cooperation, values, and country ownership for a win-win partnership? So, Gerd, with all those very easy questions, the floor is yours.
Yes, Iliana, I think we need another meeting to respond to some of these questions. They are very, very valid. But let me start with the first one on China. How should the EU deal with China in Africa? From my perspective, I would say, first of all, avoid to copy China. That's the first one, because I think when I look at the most recent strategies of the European Union, that we are sometimes forgetting a bit what Europe is strong at. And we try to copy China in a number of areas, such as big infrastructural works, the whole issue of energy, connectivity. There's nothing wrong with that. It's very important. But it is not in these areas that the European Union will, so to say, beat the Chinese at this very moment in Africa. I think that we should stand firm on the values agendas, the governance agendas. And when I look at the various strategies, I feel that these dimensions have really been neglected in recent times. They should be restored. Someone has to do it, but of course we should do it in a very different way than the way we have been doing it in the past. First of all, we should be less patronizing. We should be less working on the basis of aid conditionalities. If you don't behave well, I give you less aid. These types of tricks don't work anymore. Many African poor leaders, leadership guys, they will turn to China. They have so many alternatives at this very moment that they will not necessarily follow the conditionality logic. So we should be less patronizing, and we should, of course, be much more coherent ourselves in not applying double standards. And this is one of the issues that is still happening a lot in many African countries. And then last but not least, I think the European Union also has a major role to play to target the dynamic forces in society, mainly young people in African society. At this very moment, there's not enough attention and outreach towards these new dynamic actors, be it startups in economic terms, be it paralegals who are trying to deal with governance issues, accountability issues. That's where the European Union should focus on much more. And I hope that the NDICI programming will help to do so. Because as of now, we won't talk anymore of government ownership in developing countries, but country ownership. So it means that the whole of society should be part and should be feeling ownership of the type of efforts and cooperation that the European Union is promoting. On the two other questions, very quickly, political will, I think the pressure is such at this moment, and to some extent this COVID-19 context is maybe healthy. The pressure is such that we are trying more than ever to cooperate at this very moment, because we realize that we have to do it. And Team Europe is just one example, but it's a good example of where we try to cooperate, where we try to work together. And then the last question, what was it again? A streamlined vision. A streamlined vision. Yes, it's true that each of us 27 has its own vision on a number of issues. There's nothing wrong with a diversity of visions and views and priorities, as long as they do not contradict each other. And in my view, we are sometimes still having contradicting policies amongst the EU member states in Africa, and that is very damaging. I stop here.
Thank you, Daniel.
Yes, thanks a lot. To be very brief, I will take an example in order to try to address some of the points mentioned in the questions and some comments made by Gabriel. I will take the example of the EU-Mercosur trade agreement. So this agreement, for the moment, was blocked by some EU member states for environmental reasons, but also for internal situation of some farmers. I mean, I'm working in a Paris-based think tank, so I'm really aware of that. The real issue, if we want to find new way to dialogue and to build partnerships with other regions, would be to try to answer to the questions that what would be the trade agreement between the Europe and the Mercosur countries that would allow these both regions to really implement the 2030 agenda. And this is the kind of dialogue that we should build in order to see what kind of trade do we want in order to really support SDGs, pathways and strategies within this region. And this is something that this would allow Europe to push for many of the values that Geert mentioned, and many of the issues that many European member states push for. But it will also allow to a new way of dialogue, because it's the common framework that we agree on. So it's not a matter of saying that from the European side, we have our own vision and we want the other to go in this direction. No, it's to, okay, let's take the common framework we agreed on all together, and let's find the way to cooperate and to build partnerships in order to address these challenges. Thanks.
Okay, so thank you very much. I don't know, Gabriel, if you may want to comment something on regarding migration and NDICI and Spain, since this question came after your intervention.
Yes, well, very briefly, Ileana, because this actually merits a full set, I would say, of sessions. Well, this is one of the most complex issues to be solved, yet to be solved, from the foreign and development policy relationship. And actually, we are in Spain. I mean, Spain is recognized for having built a successful approach in the past to to coupling development efforts with migration management, and we are trying to rebuild this narrative in the same way. We see a huge potential, and a very important need on regular migration in the medium to long term, actually in the short term as well, to sustain most of our social system. So we try to see also an opportunity for us and for the especially African countries, but in the case of Spain, Latin America is the most important origin of migrants. And from this perspective, what we need to bring together is our specific policies to, well, first, obviously, the traditional development approach to migration, which is in the long term, we need to face in a comprehensive way, bringing security, peace, social inclusion, equality, etc., to the same equation at the country level. Also helping countries to manage their internal and cross-border migration challenges, which are bigger in most cases than the ones we are actually facing in Spain, meaning internal African movements. So helping countries and supporting countries on their capacities to manage properly these fluxes, and to very specifically face the mafias and the human trafficking, very dramatic problematic that they are facing, and we are all facing. And coupling this development in the more longer term efforts and the more short term increased capacity for management of irregular and unsafe and dynamics with regular and circular schemes of migration. So putting also our own needs in terms of socio-demographic trends and which are the other side of the coin of the opportunities to the same equation. So I mean, this is very complex, and this is what we are actually trying to push in the coming months and maybe probably years. Thanks, Eliana.
Okay, so we've run out of time, unfortunately, and we do need a 3 or 4 series of workshops on EU development cooperation. But thank you very much, Gabriel, Gert, Damien. This was almost an ETTG event, since we were 3 out of 6 ETTG think tanks participating in this event. So thank you very much for being with us. Thank you to the audience, and well, hopefully we will have new opportunities to discuss this topic in the coming months.
Thank you very much, Eliana.
Bye, thanks a lot.
Thanks.